Hello, my name is Jackie Huggins and I'm the co-patron of Reconciliation Queensland. This week is National Reconciliation Week. It's also the 20th anniversary of the bridge walks over Sydney Harbour Bridge and other parts of Australia. Those bridge walks were the largest gatherings and marches in Australia. So that speaks volumes for the support that non-Indigenous people gave to us on that very cold day in May as we walked across the Sydney Harbour Bridge. The theme for this week is In This Together. And we are very much in this together still, some 20 years later. There are 5 dimensions to reconciliation, and we will have an eminent panel speaking to those 5 dimensions this week. We hope that you will enjoy them just as much as I will this week. I'd like to now introduce Morris Serico, who will do the official acknowledgement to country.
Welcome to our final web seminar in our series of seminars for National Reconciliation Week. Today's seminar will be on the important topic of unity, and that will unify all the other topics that have been covered this week. I would like to acknowledge the First Nations people of Queensland. I would like to express respect for their elders in times past and times coming, and also to acknowledge any sorry business that is taking place amongst our communities today. I'd now like you to meet Uncle Bill and our eminent panel.
Let's talk unity. The State of Reconciliation in Australia report defines the unity dimension as a state in which all of Australian society values and recognises Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and heritage as part of a shared national identity. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures are the oldest living cultures in the world. In order to achieve a sense of national unity, all Australians should feel a certain pride in the tens of thousands of years of those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. Learning about and connecting with the rich and diverse history is key to embracing and celebrating the ancient heritage that underpins our national story. Unfortunately, for far too many years, dominant colonial narratives have worked to overshadow the important histories and heritage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, despite their unique place as the first Australians. A national identity focused on the romanticised tradition of the bush legend, democracy and the free-spirited Bronze Aussie was born out of these dominant discourses, problematically relegating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and heritage to the past, and neglecting to acknowledge their past, present and future significance. Encouragingly, over time, Australia's national identity has evolved to better embrace multiculturalism, diversity and inclusivity. It is important to emphasise the need for a shared national identity, one which might be multifaceted, but which effectively reflects all citizens and our entire history as a nation. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and heritage are an integral and important part of this shared identity and deserve to be proudly represented and celebrated. Our pride in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures is shown to be slowly increasing, and more Australians believe it is important to learn more. The greatest challenge is in turning this goodwill into action and positive change. For example, while the majority of Australians think it is important to know more, most rate their knowledge of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures as low. Many Australians want to contribute to reconciliation, but only a small number claim they know how they can contribute. Furthermore, they have an opportunity to progress national actions that will improve relationships and help unify Australia in the same manner as the 2008 national apologies to the stolen generations did. But there is still much work to be done. Organisations such as Reconciliation Australia and Reconciliation Queensland have a clear role to play in educating all Australians about reconciliation and how they can meaningfully contribute to the nation's reconciliation journey. Australians are now better placed than ever before for the long-sought reconciliation milestone of constitutional recognition. To this end, all Australians can help strengthen unity by supporting a referendum for meaningful recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Constitution, as well as their voice in the Parliament. Moreover, there are still some steps to go before a referendum. All Australians have a role to play by talking to and learning from people from all walks of life. Actively listening to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, developing proposals for their support and making positive contributions to a national conversation around unity and reconciliation more generally are all positive steps. The desire of people wanting to learn more about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures supports the inclusion of these as a compulsory part of the school curricula. It's also important that we consider the First Peoples of Australia and their call through the Uluru Statement for a voice in the Australian Parliament, and for there to be a process for truth-telling so as our nation can truly come to terms with our needs as we move towards reconciliation.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the final in our 5-part series of webinars during Reconciliation Week this year. And I'd like to just take the moment to introduce you to our panellists. We're going to be dealing this morning or this afternoon with the subject of unity as a dimension of reconciliation. And it's important, I suppose, here in Queensland, for many of those joining us with the live stream today, is we'll begin to unpack this dimension and have a bit of a look at it shortly. I'd like to just take a moment now to just introduce to you our panellists for today. And I'd like to start off with Samara Jose from Cairns. Samara, do you want to, I suppose, share a bit with us about what you do, and I suppose also perspectives around, youth and unity that you're passionate about?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Samara Jose. I'm a proud Gajala Kukuyalanji Dalialan woman. I was born and raised in Cairns, and I don't think I'll ever leave here. And I am currently the co-founder and chairperson for a small not-for-profit that we started here in Cairns called DIG, Deadly Inspiring Youth Doing Good. And our organisation was born from the idea of young people that we needed to demonstrate that there are deadly young blackfellas and we're not all, the whole stereotype thing. But also that, we wanted to be able to make our stamp in our country and sort of put ourselves out there to stand on our own 2 feet. Unity is really interesting for us because even though we're an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander corporation, but we've been formed from the beginning with a collective of non-Indigenous members and participants. So that connection and that relationship in terms of unity has always sort of been there for us. But we've always talked about the fact that for us as young people, it's about sharing our histories, our families, our lands, and sharing that with our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters. Because good ways, like we're connected. As young people, we got friends and brothers and sisters from all kinds of places. My best friend is a Papua New Guinean woman. And that connectivity and that relationship, the friendships that we have, open doorways, I guess, for us to have conversations about the struggles and the injustices that our First Nations mob are facing, that I was facing, that, my aunties and uncles, the things that were happening in our families.
Thank you, Samara, and I'll look forward to hearing more about that connectivity, particularly the need for more connectivity of our youth to what's actually happening, in the broader stage nationally around reconciliation as well, and how that can be forged ahead as we look at unity more. We've got probably like to introduce Ross Daniels. Ross is joining us today as a co-chair of ANTAR, which is the Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation. And Ross, has been around this subject of reconciliation pretty well from the beginning, back in 1992, and he offers us, I suppose, a great perspective from a non-Indigenous person's point of view in looking at unity and the struggle we're having to get a unified position on reconciliation as we move forward. Ross, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey so far?
Yeah, sure, Uncle Bill. Hello, everybody. Lovely to join you. Really important day, lovely ceremony. 6 years ago, I retired from the university. It was like dying and going to heaven. And it's been a fantastic last 6 years with my little grandchildren. And my children remind me all the time that they exist as well as the grandchildren. I come from Rocky. It's the Darrinbal people. And I found out a few years ago a lovely connection through my great-grandmother to the Iman tribe, Iman people who come from the Roma to the Banana area. And I'm still hunting down that. And a few years ago, my wife and I went out to her grave out near Theodore, and it was a spectacularly wonderful moment. I've been in and around this and other human rights matters for many years. There's a woman who I have extraordinary admiration for, and that's Mary Graham, who everybody knows. And she said something one day that really didn't shock me. I thought it was really a telling statement. You see, somebody like me, I live in a leafy suburb. I have nice trees, nice home, etc., etc. When the government said for everybody to go home because of the coronavirus, I really was quite surprised about their ignorance about the conditions under which lots of people live, and this idea that you can go home and self-quarantine at home. Okay for me, not okay for many other people. So Mary Graham once said to me, it's okay for you white fellas, you can come into this and go out of it as your choice. Black fellas, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, don't have a choice. They're continually in this, and through a little bit of work that I do with ANTAR, every single day is a sorry day for somebody or some family. So I guess I'm coming at this from a point of view that nothing will happen in this country without the most profound change from the non-Indigenous people who are here. And if there's a slight contribution that myself and others can make, that is the key mover. If we're going to have unity, something has to happen, not with the Indigenous people, but with the other mob.
Well, look, thank you, Ross. We'll look forward to hearing more about that story of yours as well. We've got Thomas Mayer with us. Thomas has been a coordinator, I suppose, looking at the Uluru Statement, and importantly, he was part of that journey. Thomas, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and I suppose also how the Uluru Statement has actually been a force for moving us towards unity, particularly for First Nations people?
Yeah, thanks, Uncle Bill. Coming to you from Larrakia country, acknowledge the traditional owners here. I'm a Torres Strait Islander, that's my background, and I'm born here on Larrakia country and have always lived here. And I've got a perspective on unity that comes from my workplace, really. I mean, I became a wharfie when I was 17 years old. Worked with lots of colourful characters here on the wharf, and I know Cairns there, where Samara's from, was a pretty colourful place on the water side as well. And on the wharf, I was there in 1998 during the Patrick's dispute when the government, John Howard government, colluded with the Patrick stevedores to rip us out of our livelihoods, basically. because of the strength of our union as Wharfies, the Maritime Union of Australia, which is a union that I'm an official of today. I became an elected official of the MUA. But on the wharf, through the Patrick's dispute, through the constant attacks that were focused at us because of our strength, and because not only because of our wages and conditions, but also the fact that the MUA played a big part in many social justice struggles, such as the Wave Hill Walk-Off, such as the Pilbara strike, such as the anti-apartheid struggle, where our seafarers refused to sail any ships with oil to South Africa to put pressure on the apartheid regime. We were always under attack. So I learnt the great value of unionism from my union background, but importantly to what we're talking about today, the unity of the entire nation and the unity of Indigenous people. This structure that I learnt about that is behind unity was a valuable lesson. That unity was not something that we just beat our chests about on a stump at a rally, as tends to happen, or in a forum on a panel session, but there was actually a structure that was established, that was understood, and that was democratically shaped by the members of that union. And then I also knew about the hard work that went into consensus building, and these things saw that unity was useful, and that's why we talk about unity. What is useful? What can we do with a better, a more united country and a more united people? And so this is the perspective that I come from, going into the opportunity to be involved in what ended up as the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And the Uluru Statement came from an unprecedented process, Indigenous-led and designed. Professor Megan Davis, a Cobble woman, public law expert, designed the process. And this opportunity for us to say, as Indigenous people, how we wanted to be united, which is why the Uluru Statement proposes a voice, and then how we wanted the country to come together. And that goes to the rule book of the nation, and including us in that, the Constitution.
Well, look, thanks, Thomas, and we'll have a little bit more of an understanding. We might get you to actually unpack a bit of what was in that statement, the Uluru Statement, which is from the heart. And we've also got today with us on our panellists Mr. Charles Geyer. Charles is the Secretary of the South East Queensland Indigenous Chamber of Commerce, and has been in that position, and one of the founding directors or members of that organisation as well. Charles has a long history in business and is a small business person himself. Charles, would you like to, and you bring an interesting perspective as just like the average Australian to this, of just how unity affects you as an individual, but also a Torres Strait Islander as well.
Yeah, thanks, Uncle Bill. Yeah, look, before I get into that, I'd just like to acknowledge custodians of the land that we meet on. I just wanted to also do a shout out to our mob up North Queensland there. That's my mother's country. That's where I was born, Yindinji and Mamu people, and also Dad's family up in the Torres Straits, namely Thursday Island, Bardu and Moa. Also, look, I'd like to, express my respect and love for our elders, past, present and emerging. And lastly, in the spirit, I suppose, in terms of unity, I'd like to acknowledge and say hello and offer warm wishes to my family, my wife, my sons, my partners, my granddaughter, brothers and sisters, mums and dads, uncles, aunties, pops and nans, whoever you may be. Warm wishes to everybody, I suppose. Look, there's been a lot happening, I guess, in terms of, business, I guess, and reconciliation over the years. I'll probably talk a little bit more about that, Bill, as we get going in this particular webinar. But certainly there are lots of things that are happening at a national level, at a state level, and also regional level. And in particular, the stuff that's happening in Queensland is pretty much, you know, probably taking a good step towards reconciliation, bit of sharing that that wealth in the state, you know what I mean, with our mob now. So it's really good in that sense. But we still have a lot more to do in terms of unity, I guess. And I guess where I'm coming from is more that ground level sort of stuff where we saw in 2000, 250,000 people walk across bridges for side by side, Australians from all walks of life around Sorry Day. And it's that stuff that we really need to get back to. Whether that is at a community level where, and I'll talk a bit more about this, I suppose, where, we've grown up with people we call our brothers and our sisters, and who support us. We've worked with guys that and other staff members who work beside us, and do things. But it's just that I think the thing for me in terms of it's about opening the door so people can come in and join us, in this journey of reconciliation, if you like, and unity. But that's where I come from, I suppose. I think I can talk a bit more about the business stuff as we get going. But yeah, definitely keen on having some conversations around my next door neighbour, for instance. Guy down the street, the shop up the road. How do we get them involved in this stuff, and how do we get them to initiate some of that rather than waiting for an Aboriginal group or a corporation or a council to get it going, So interesting stuff.
Well, so thanks, Charles. And that sort of gets to the heart of what these webinars are about. It's for, all Queenslanders, all of our citizens to really have an opportunity to understand what unity as a dimension of reconciliation is all about. But importantly, you understand that unity also, I suppose, in one way, brings together all of those other dimensions. And Auntie Jackie Huggins, at the beginning of our transmission, outlined those 5 particular dimensions of unity as being race relations, equality and equity, institutional integrity, historical acceptance, and unity, which is the element we're dealing with today. So if we think about all of those sort of dimensions and the way we need to have a unified approach and vision for those things, then I think today's discussion will go, we'll begin to explore how the person next door can actually get on board a bit, with us and to understand what exactly is happening. Look, in saying that, it's important, I suppose, I want to share with you a quote from Dr. Tom Calma, who's the co-chair of Reconciliation Australia. And in introducing unity in the discussion guide on the dimensions, he sort of made a statement, I think, which sort of resonates a little bit with us here as to what we need as First Nations people to be doing, as well as other non-Indigenous people. He says here in Australia, we're fortunate enough to have one of the richest and oldest continuing cultures in the world. This is something we should all be proud of and celebrate. It's a fairly basic statement. It's a statement of fact. We are the oldest and one of the richest, sort of continuing cultures in the world here in Australia. And I suppose the thing is that it's something we as a nation need to consider, how we should be all proud and to celebrate that. And I know we'll have a little look at that sort of proposition a little later on in our discussion. But I'd like to start off in terms of the unity discussion today, just to sort of pose a basic question to all in the panel to maybe just consider and to respond to. And that is, if we're striving for unity, then what are the key elements, or what is just one element that you see at the moment that is holding us back as a nation? Now, that's a fairly big ask to maybe think of one. I can think of probably several, like many, but I think if you could think of one, particularly from the perspective of, and we might start with Samara, particularly from a youth perspective. There are many things that sort of, not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander youth, but generally all youth in Australia. There are things that are holding people back. Samara, what do you think a key one of those might be?
Yeah, look, I agree. There's a whole range of different things that are, I guess, impacting our ability to move forward and unite as a nation. And I think for young people, what's been really interesting is, I come from a background of teaching, of facilitating a program with my manager at the time, and we ran an Indigenous youth leadership program for the region. And the things that she taught me around knowing our history, just even the significant events that have happened in our history that have gotten us to this particular point. As a young person leaving high school, man, I knew nothing, and it's really interesting that we talk, like, for that one pure basic fact of, I don't know and understand the historical context that sometimes our people have been through, and why thought patterns and why people think this way, or why our elders tell us this thing, and they, that's it. It comes from a lot of hurt and anger and pain, that these kinds of discussions around our history is hard. But I guess, so the point is, like, the idea of, we're not taught our history in schools. As a young person, we had to go on this journey outside of our own school program to then go out and find all this information and research ourselves to be able to understand why we are in the position that we're in. I then went out, with a team of other young people, and we hosted these kinds of after hours things and conversations, and we started looking at our ways that we can look at Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander leadership. But it became more than just about Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander leadership. It became about the leadership of just young people, and looking at the idea of how do we know where we're going when we don't know where we've come from?
That's a good point. I sort of think, Samara, there you've touched on one of the key elements, which is, education, and for people to be aware of those things. But the other thing that you did hint in there, and I think really for a lot of our First Nations peoples, we struggle with, is the intergenerational trauma issue, and the fact that we need to be going through a healing process, not so much a unity process, if you're with me. We need to actually heal before we can actually then begin to regroup and look at how we can actually forge a better future. And I think that's a struggle that youth find themselves in the crossfire of, as well, with the different generations.
Absolutely. Sometimes, we don't know which way's up, because we're being told so many different viewpoints from so many different people that it's almost like we're being bombarded with the ideas and the views that we're supposed to have as young people. And I think that there's a lot of, shedding in terms of supporting young people to figure out the journey, and at the end of the day, our young people are going to be the people who have to support the process and heal. And, it's so hard sometimes when, we've got young people who are in our child safety systems and disconnected from their families, and the kinship relationships that, we're offering is, and the connection that we can have with them is pure on the fact that we're Indigenous, and what we know from our families and our context that we can share. Like, those are it's hard because we see the pain in our other brothers and sisters. So for us, we're also feeling their pain as well.
I gather, it's a bit harder when you're in the middle of living life sometimes to be able to deal with these sorts of, bigger issues as well. And particularly for youth in our society, that is always, a challenge. Look, we might come back and have a bit more of a look at that, because education and that whole issue of intergenerational sort of trauma and the need for healing are certainly key issues we need to look at. And as one of the dimensions in reconciliation deals with is around, truth and historical acceptance. That's part of that whole process that we need to begin to unpack a little bit further. I might just ask Charles, is there an element that you can see in here from a business perspective? Now, I don't just mean as an Indigenous business person, but from a non-Indigenous person's business perspective as well, that is will help us move forward in terms of unity. That's sort of holding us back at the moment for the business sector to be more fully engaged in this process.
Yeah, look, that statement or that comment that you wrote, you read out, Bill, from Mr. Calmer,
Tom Calmer,
Tommy Calmer, yeah, and I think that's hits the nail on the head for me. I think it's our identity is something that an Australian identity is something that we really struggle with. Not us, but I mean all of Australians, and I think that in terms of business. We've got to start realising that there are some really talented people out there that are, in business, but a lot of it's based on, the product and the service that we provide. Of course, Queensland's kind of, put cultural tourism up as one of their key, targets or goals for this year. Unfortunately, COVID come along and it slowed us down. But just the same, they obviously identified that, that's a key area of tourism, I suppose, for tourism and hospitality for, visitors from all over the country. So, and yet, local people, local Australians live in Queensland, don't go on those adventures. They should do. I'm sure they are. I'm only assuming that they don't, but, the need is based on, international travel, which is now stopped. So it's quite interesting that, we are now encouraged to do some, travelling and holidaying around our own state, for instance. So, but I think one of the things that holds us back in terms of unity is that people in terms of business, I suppose, don't know how to engage. They don't know where to go or what to do or what to say and all that sort of stuff. And it holds people back. It kind of prevents a conversation. It prevents opportunities, I suppose. And the other way around as well, I'm guilty of it. I'm hesitant about going forward and saying, hey, this is who I am and what I do. This is what I'm selling. And it's a little bit of a two-way street. And it's always going to be like that, going forward. But the sooner we open our doors and, welcome people in, I think, and, get to know each other, I think that's the thing. I had a chat with someone the other day and I was talking about, everything that's happening in the world, but, here in Australia, and I said, look, I'm doing this reconciliation thing on Wednesday. And it dawned on me that, in terms of reconciliation, we don't want, well, it's like this, I don't want everyone to love me or love us. I'd like them to like us, but at least I want them to know that we're here. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, yeah, we're here. You don't have to, you can have your opinions and have your own thoughts about that, but, basically we're here, and we'll always be in here to engage with, to talk to have a yarn, have a conversation. So, it's really, and I know that at a national level, we need to be pushing the buttons in terms of what government's doing in terms of reconciliation and, a little bit about treaty in a minute. I'm sure Thomas will have a chat to us about that and constitutional change, all that sort of stuff. But at a local level, people are still hesitant about engaging. It's that old, I used to, it's that old, situation where people are afraid to meet and have a chat. You know what I mean? So I think that's one area, I suppose, for me that holds us back a little bit. We really need to engage the critical mass, and they're living beside us and all around us, and we work with them, as I mentioned earlier. We went to school with them, we played sport with them, and now we're doing business with them. So what is it that we do? What is it that we can do to encourage that engagement? That's a good conversation starter, I suppose. But then at the other side of things is that it seems like it's either a corporation, it's either a local government, or it's an Aboriginal organisation that's running reconciliation events and activities. Whereas we'd like to have seen small groups, neighbourhood centres, whatever, RSLs, surf lifesaving clubs, doing something together, and coming from that left field really and saying, they're running a reconciliation event. And reconciliation, as we all know, is not just this week. It's actually opportunities to do stuff in NAIDOC, opportunities to do stuff throughout the year to engage. So, I think it's important that we try and, unpack some of that stuff.
Yep.
Yeah, that prevents people from, good conversations.
That's good. No, thanks, Charles. You've given us a lot to think about there. I think, well, I'm not thinking, I know you've given us a lot to think about. We're certainly a big challenge in how people can be more engaged in this journey. And I know with businesses there are the opportunities to become, RAP organisations, or to have a reconciliation action plan and to register and to get a plan. But for many businesses, who are just tied up in the everyday, business of making a living and surviving out there in a marketplace that's currently under threat, serious threat and significant sort of hard times around COVID. Things like reconciliation can be very, very much off the radar. And it's important, I think, we actually think about, we are more about actually being homegrown. You mentioned cultural tourism in Queensland as being, a major offering. And I do know with Indigenous, First Nations groups across the country, it's something that is very much part of their forward thinking in terms of, their economic participation in the Queensland economy. And things like COVID, have been a serious setback to that. So, maybe there's an opportunity for us to reconcile around, more innovative ways to make these things more sustainable and more resilient to things like the pandemics, and that's part of the process of moving forward. Look, I think there's some interesting elements in there, but I know, Ross, there are several, key factors there with, at a much bigger play around the political level. And I know you've had a lot to do around native title and just the divisiveness that's happened in the non-Indigenous community around native title and within the Aboriginal communities themselves. It has been a struggle to get any unit, any sort of, common agreement sometimes around those matters. Are there any thoughts you have there as we move forward?
Yeah, look, you said one, and I would go back to something that Samara mentioned. I think Australians are great believers in myths. We have constructed some very comfortable myths. One of the myths is we have the best multicultural nation on earth. Now, I have no empirical evidence for that whatsoever, and I've been to many other places that would make us look pretty pedantic. But we need to give up myths, and one of the first myths is the place wasn't discovered. And when you use the word invaded, then you know that you're probably not going to get invited back to wherever you were. So there's a whole, every word around history is contestable. in this country. And I don't think we move much until we have been able to get around this. When I was little, this is a very silly example, when I was little and at school, I felt so sorry for Burke and Wills, who apparently starved to death somewhere after discovering the inland of Australia led by Aboriginal people. Even that phrase is really quite problematic, isn't it? You discover something, but you're actually led. They died of starvation, and I do feel sorry for them. Don't get me wrong, but actually they died of starvation. It was similar to dying in Pizza Hut. There was food everywhere. They didn't know anything about it. So, if you look at the books that have been written recently about what the first white people saw when they went over this country, it is entirely different to the narrative that I was exposed to, and to the comforting narrative that we discovered. It's a harsh land, and it's all that other, I can't swear because we're on Facebook, but it's all that other nonsense, none of that is true. Every time you go anywhere, every name that is used is in some way insulting. Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria. Start with that, eh? Start with discovery. Start with all of those very ordinary things which say those who invaded and conquered are still in charge. And until we give up some of that, a lot of that, the hope for unity diminishes greatly. I'll give you a very good example of this, Uncle Bill. If I went down today to Parliament House and graffitied some of the paintings on the wall, it would be on the news. I would be momentarily famous, and then I would be in trouble. Only a few days ago, a 45,000-year-old sacred site was bulldozed by Rio Tinto. Kangaroo legs, 28,000 years old. Plaited hair, 4,500 years old. The Pyramid of Giza, 4,500 years old. Why aren't Australians up in arms about the desecration and destruction of this is not just something about Aboriginal people, this is something about Australia. Why aren't we not just so making precious this historical, unbelievable archaeological legacy that we've got in this country? I think the start to that is in changing the narrative. How do you do that? Well, if I knew that, I'd get a lot of money. But I know you can't do that by talking to people in mirrors. And a lot of what I do is talking to somebody in a mirror, because it comes back to the same message. When I feel that I need to punish myself, I go on Facebook to some of these groups that don't accept Invasion Day, don't accept reconciliation, don't accept treaty. And if you want to know what we're up against, that's an eye into the enormous difficulties. And and Thomas certainly has alluded to this, that this narrative only changes with political leadership, and then political leadership means election. Election means divisive leverage. And I agree totally with Thomas that until we are really fully engaged in the political spectrum, we can't really make great moves on the narrative perspective. So that's enough from me. But, I think if you said one thing, it's the narrative of this country. It is our living in myths that is the greatest challenge to unity.
Oh. And look, that's a great observation. Certainly we have to really look at our narrative, and where we've been and where we're going. And I suppose as a First Nations person, I certainly know that our narrative, BC, before Cook, that is, was one that, where we had a completely different worldview of where we are now. And so it's very hard, for example, unless, you've actually spent quite a bit of time, continue, with the cultural side of things and stuff, that, to actually appreciate just how different that worldview is. And many of us have. And for non-Indigenous people, it's really coming from a completely different perspective to Australia. And Australia as being the land of opportunity, the land of as you were saying, this is sort of a land where you can come, diverse nations from all over the world, and yet they do not know what is actually sitting right there in front of them. And so it really augurs back to some of those issues around education and making sure that people understand fully those sorts of things, but also a preparedness of our citizens to actually, value and respect that culture. I know, Thomas, there's been a lot of talk there, and certainly Ross gave us, I think, a great segue into some of the sort of issues that you've been struggling with too, with the Uluru, getting people to actually take that on board as a serious, sort of not a serious, but a serious proposition with the Australian government. Do you want to share with us, one or two things that you've experienced in that side of it that's really holding unity back from political leadership?
Arnie Pat Anderson was the co-chair of the process that led to the Uluru Statement endorsement. She was a co-chair of the Referendum Council, and something that she said not long before Malcolm Turnbull so disrespectfully dismissed the Uluru Statement was that basically that the politicians would be the greatest barrier, not the Australian people. And so it goes to what Ross mentioned, and that there is, without being able to, and basically what you're saying, mate, is that without being able to influence the political decision makers, the decision makers at the top of the tree in Australia, then we are not going to be able to influence the Australian narrative and make that one that is truly a united story. The wonderful thing about the Uluru Statement, just going back to reconciliation for a moment, is that for the first time in our history since colonisation, we have had a national process led by Indigenous leaders, experts, that covered all parts of the southern sky, all parts of the continent and its adjacent islands, and had a formula applied to that. It was an open invitation, and some people criticise it for that, but this is the expertise of a public law expert like Professor Megan Davis coming out here. You must have a formula to include the cross-section of perspectives of Indigenous peoples from all those different backgrounds and different political beliefs and different experiences of the impact of colonialism. For the first time, we had that opportunity. And then at Uluru 3 years ago, we, after 3 days of passionate debate, an overwhelming majority was reached, a consensus that said, this is the next step in reconciliation. And so from that point, reconciliation became more than about educating people about what needs to change and bringing people with us to go on a journey to change things towards a reconciled nation. But it actually said, this is what we want you to do. And specifically, that is to enshrine a First Nations voice in the Constitution and to establish a Makarrata Commission for a process of truth-telling and agreement making. Now, everything that all of my brothers and sisters here on this panel have said, all of when we talked about the issues, and even Ross also, you talked about the root cause, really, of all of our issues is the laws and policies that are made in Canberra. And the answer to the question that Ross asked has already been answered by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in that unique consensus. We are not heard in this democracy. And I'll touch on that for a moment. We are less than 3% of the population in a democracy. Already we're outnumbered as far as the influence on the politicians go, right? So the indifference that cause all these things comes from this, what I'm talking about. If we are already less than 2% of the population, and from my experience running around the seat of Lingiari here, 98% of the Northern Territory, majority Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, I have seen that our ability to engage in the democracy as less than 2% of the as less than 3% of the population is hindered by our poverty and by our remote living. And so therefore, the problem is with unity, the greatest barrier is that the members of Parliament, the Parliament, does not represent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And because we do not choose them. And so the indifference, the mistakes, and I don't think that it's a matter of malice to Indigenous people. And I don't think that a majority of the Parliament is racist, although I do say that some of them are. The problem is that we don't hold them to account, because when the majority of the Australian people do go to the polling booths when there's a federal election, they don't think about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues. They think about a whole lot else. And so that is the purpose of the voice. Our rallies and our protests is a form of being heard, but it is not working in isolation and without multiple layers of advocacy. And so the greatest thing that we can do for unity in this country is get behind the campaign for a constitutionally enshrined voice. And I'll just touch on this. Sorry if I'm taking a bit long, Uncle Bill. The constitutional enshrinement is difficult, yes. Referendums are very hard to win in this country. 8 out of 44 have been successful. But the Uluru Statement is not a statement on its own. It's a continuation of petitions and statements going back more than 100 years. Yirrkala Bark petitions, Larrakia petition to the Queen, Barunga Statement, all dashed against the rocks of political expediency. But one of the things that the Uluru Statement learns is that all of our strong representative voices that we have ever built, going to the 1920s, the AAPA, Fred Maynard, a fellow Wharfie, was a president of that association, all the way through to ATSIC. And to go back to the youth, it's interesting, Samara, a lot of the people that were young in ATSIC are leaders in today's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander world, right? So we lost that breeding ground, that black on black education about black politics, about broader politics, about bureaucracy. But every voice that we've built, ATSIC, the First Peoples Congress, have all been smashed by a hostile government. The first thing we must do is build a representative body, and we must protect it from the same fate as all of our other representative bodies. And therefore we must have the courage to say that we won't take no for an answer from the government, and that we will stand up also against the misinformation, both from the far right and mob that think that somehow a white fella document can take away our sovereignty, because it cannot. You know, our identity is not that fickle. This simply empowers us and gives us the means to be heard in a democracy that doesn't hear us right now. And so that's I think what the biggest barrier is, and that's what we have to do specifically to achieve unity and a better country.
Well, thanks, Thomas. The one of the things that sort of, I suppose, resonates with me at the moment is the fact that the Uluru Statement it's a bit like hurry up and wait. We've been, as you were saying, you know, we've tried this several times. We've made various approaches to the Australian government, you know, who represent the interests of the Australian people, and also it's been very difficult moving forward, even on matters of treaty. Yet we see some of the states are actually beginning to move forward on these matters, like Victoria and Queensland here, where we're moving forward on treaty and discussion. It also interests me in a time of COVID, when we talk about unity, our government has had to become unified around COVID. And what we've seen here is rather an interesting movement in the Australian government itself to actually do away with the Council of Australian Governments, which was set up by Paul Keating back in 1992 when the reconciliation legislation came into being as well. And interestingly, we now see that there is this new cabinet, national sort of cabinet, bringing together the state and territory leaders with the Prime Minister and forging ahead now, you know, looking at these national priorities around employment and youth. But I did see there in their communique that Indigenous affairs would still remain a national priority, as it did with the COAG and other matters. So it'd be interesting to see how that process unfolds, particularly for for Ken Wyatt, as one of our first Aboriginal ministers for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs.
Yeah, it's I mean, we've had the Closing the Gap reports for 12 years, and it's been a national priority in that sense for that long, and it's never succeeded. And so, we do need to do something different, and I think that's the voice setting up this political power for Indigenous people to influence the decisions. And it's interesting you talk about COAG. I mean, it's a non-Indigenous organisation, and even COAG. The likes of COAG is vulnerable to sudden changes. People didn't really know that this change was coming, and I know from our Indigenous peaks that it was a huge spanner in the works because they were close to a national agreement on things, and so all of a sudden COAG, who they were dealing with, it goes to the point that for us we must have consistency, okay? And so even if they change these white institutions, we must always continue to have a voice, because every 3 years, what happens is we're waiting with bated breath on who will take the lead and what will happen to our organisations, our peak bodies, and the funding for everything else that we want to do. Just quickly, if you don't mind, on treaty, Charles mentioned that. I mean, the voice is vital to treaty. I just want to finish with this quickly. The treaties are being done between the state and First Nations, or a First Nation in some circumstances. South Australia, though, was changed by one of those changes of government, we must establish this national unity of First Nations to have some strength to negotiate with the Commonwealth, the federal government, what their obligations are to treaty. And this is one of the reasons why Jill Gallagher, the first Treaty Commissioner, is such a passionate supporter of the Uluru Statement, because we need to understand that in agreement making, our log of claims with the state is limited, because the states can only provide so much given the structure of this nation and how power is divided amongst the states and territories and the federal government. So the Uluru Statement is a big supporter of treaty, and what's happening in Queensland there, it's not one or the other, but I do believe that the voice is vital to the success of treaties.
And if we think about that, in terms of, treaty here, say in Queensland, for example, a treaty recognises that we are a federation of states, and that each of the states has its independent responsibility to look after its citizens as well as its First Nations peoples as well, and to negotiate on behalf of its lands. But you are right insofar as, we do need to have a federation, like that sits behind a voice, of our First Peoples, and for them to be actually moving in that direction. And I think it's interesting times, and it's for younger people who are coming on board with the journey now and growing up into this, whether they be Indigenous or non-Indigenous Australians, for youth in this country, there is a lot to absorb, a lot to take on as we move forward. And for the rest of us, there's a lot that we need to, I suppose, consume, as well as trying to deal with the immediate priorities. I'm reminded of an interesting, thing an old fella said to me once, and that was, he said, Bill, it's a bit hard to remember. The objective of the exercise is to drain the swamp when you're up to your armpits and snapping crocodiles. So if you think about that, for a lot of us in Australia today, we are really quite distracted with a lot that's going on. But we've been on this journey for 30 years in terms of reconciliation and trying to bring this nation to a point where we can settle this matter, or to respect what is happening with our First Nations peoples, and to move forward. So it's time, I believe. And I suppose in saying that, Ross, I know that you've been on the same journey with us for this whole period. But timing has always been a problem, hasn't it?
Absolutely. This is not a good time. It's going to be difficult. Just go back to your quick comment about the Prime Minister trying to get a consensus government. I just find that extraordinarily curious. No, and because you could take a leaf out of First Nations, who have had one of the most consensus, wonderful political, social decision-making system for what, 60 to 80,000 years. We could actually take a great leaf out of decision-making, participation, consensus that's been in front of us for thousands and thousands of years. So I hope it's not a cynical move on the part of the government, but I do think that actually, just going back one step, eco-tourism and all of that sort of thing, you know what I think? When Australians go around, they're looking for the same monuments that they find in Europe and Asia, you know, the things that are built to the great people. The thing that I personally find astoundingly brilliant about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, their political systems, their social system, there was no need for that. I think that is something to be just marveled at, that a people could invent such a brilliant political, social, economic system between them. We could take a big leaf out of their book in terms of resolving what's in front of us.
Well, look, I think we've had an opportunity to cover this subject quite well today. We might have to bring it to a close, but I'd like to just go back to that statement by Tom Calma, which I think, sort of is a challenge for us in these times. And that is, he said, here in Australia, we're fortunate enough to have one of the richest and oldest continuing cultures in the world. This is something we should all be proud of and celebrate. So I suppose that's the challenge that we as citizens and as Australians need to take on as we move forward. Well, look, thank you very much. I think today we've covered quite a bit in this journey, and what we probably need to do now is to thank each of our panellists for joining us today, and thank you very much to Charles. And I know, Charles, that as an independent and as a business person, I do realise the importance of how passionate you are, not only about that, but also about your community. And that really came through today. So thank you very much for that input.
Yes, Uncle Bill. Yep, thank you very much for having us. Yep.
You're right. Thomas, always a pleasure. And we'll look forward to hearing more about how the Uluru Statement unfolds, particularly with the journey from the heart.
Thanks, Uncle Bill, and thanks to the fellow panellists and all the participants.
Yeah. Ross, ever a warrior, on the journey with us. So thank you, Ross, and we'll look forward to seeing more of you in our webinars.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the panellists.
And Samara, last but not least, but and I suppose it's with some thought I gave, I left you till last because really it's the legacy that we hand on to our youth from this journey, from many of us who've been on this journey for the last, for all of our lives. The challenge of unity still exists for us, and it still exists for our future generations. But I think things like the Uluru Statement give us hope that we can be unified and come together if we're respectful that everyone needs to have a voice. And so, Samara, in saying that, thank you very much for joining us from Cairns today as well and giving us that perspective on you.
Thank you for having me, and stay deadly, you mob.
Okay. Well, on that note, stay deadly, everyone. And I'll hand back to Auntie Jackie Huggins. And thank you for joining us in this series of webinars with Reconciliation Queensland for National Reconciliation Week. And remember, we're all in this together, and that includes the COVID. Bye for now.
Thank you very much for listening today. I hope you've enjoyed the topic, and thank you for your support. And hopefully you would have learnt many things out of this, many lessons to take home, to work within your families, your communities, your businesses, your organisations. It's all very important that we spread the word of reconciliation. So until next time, be safe on our journey together in reconciliation. Because as this theme for this week implies, we are in fact in this together. Thank you.